in Paris, and we have with us John Seaman, a security and energy, or you can say geopolitical strategist at IFRI, Institute of France on International Relations. That's the name in English, but probably Mr. Seaman can correct me on the French name that they use for IFRI.
Yeah, Institut Français des Relations Internationales.
Well, welcome to Reason, where we get to the reason behind the issues that concern you. Welcome, Mr. Seaman.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so my first question to you, you are doing a lot of research in Europe-China relations, also on renewable energy, also on rare earth elements. But today, given how the relationship between US and China has evolved in the last few years, with the Biden administration particularly showing a lot of aggression and taking a tough stand against China. But in the recent past, we've also seen the Biden administration taking U-turns on China, especially Taiwan, for example. And we know that the US has finally said that the US believes in one China policy. So where do you see this relationship going with these ups and downs, with so much theatrics even on Taiwan, Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan? But at the end, the US is also trying to build some kind of cooperation with China.
Well, I think something that we need to understand from the beginning is that it's very difficult to identify the chicken and the egg in this sort of spiraling relationship between the U.S. and China. Certainly, the U.S. position on China has shifted. We can't necessarily put all of the blame on the U.S. side. Things in China have shifted as well. China has become much more assertive on the global scene, on the regional scene as well. And internally, China's domestic politics have turned much more authoritarian, much more repression internally within China. It's become much harder to do business in China. And so China's domestic scene has changed. China has become more assertive and more aggressive, or at least more aggressive in the way in which it defends its own interests. And that tends to rub up against the U.S. And the U.S.'s role in the region. It tends to rub up against the U.S.'s regional partners and its allies, Japan or South Korea. The role of Taiwan, as you mentioned, is very sticky. And so, unfortunately, we found ourselves in this sort of spiraling relationship where things are. It's difficult to see where you can actually find an off-ramp. In the U.S.-China relationship, but it's also very difficult to actually pinpoint, the real reasoning behind why things have gone in this direction. But I think there is blame to be laid on both sides, and I think in many ways it's important that both sides sort of take a step back. And it seems from the Biden administration currently that is what they're trying to do. They've essentially identified areas in which they're not willing to accept a certain level of strategic competition from China. They look at the development of artificial intelligence in particular and say this is an area where we are potentially heading towards a much greater militarization, finding new military uses for new technologies such as AI, potential emerging technologies such as quantum, and the US views China's development in these fields as a potential threat, particularly as China overtly says that it is aiming for what they call civil-military fusion. Very difficult to identify the difference between a civilian use and a military use in the field of AI, for instance. And so the US looks at that as very concerning for its own future stability, for its own security, but also for the security of its partners in the region. And so on issues like that, the US is willing to take a very hard line to essentially try to stop or severely limit China's ability to develop certain technologies which will pose a direct threat, or what it perceives as a direct threat to U.S. national security, the security of its allies. But around that, there are of course a number of issues where the U.S. and China have to work together. They have common interests, whether it's on climate change, I guess, is sort of an easy one that we put out there, but that's obviously sort of the number one challenge for the globe as we move forward. But also things like non-proliferation, the global financial system, debt restructuring, things like that. These are issues where the U.S. and China have to work together, and they have a common interest in working together. So it seems that the U.S. is trying to search currently for guardrails to the relationship. It's obvious that things are going to get more problematic, as seen both from Beijing and from Washington. There are points of friction, but the idea is to try to make it so that those points of friction don't necessarily lead into a much broader head-on confrontation between the two that will impact the entire globe and will ultimately undermine everybody's interests, their own included.
So, how do you see this relationship where you're saying that both countries should step back and look at ways and means to cooperate with each other? It's important that they work together. How is this crisis or tension between the US and China affecting Europe? Is it also impacting the relationship between China and Europe?
It is, but I would also say that some of those same factors that have pushed the United States to question its relationship and to question a policy of engagement with China have also pushed a more skeptical view here in Europe. For a long time we thought that engagement with China was sort of the only path forward. But we've also noticed that a number of policies in China have worked counter to European interests. And one key area is in economic policy. For a long time, we looked at engagement with China. And the more you engage with China, the more China liberalizes and becomes a sort of a responsible stakeholder in the global system. Now, it's not really necessarily a European term, but the thought being that eventually China will put in place economic reforms that will allow our two economies and our economic actors to play on what we would call a level playing field. As time has gone by, we've seen that China has been willing to put in place economic policies that distort markets, very clearly distort markets, in ways that ultimately undermine the ability of European firms to be competitive in new and emerging industries or areas where we consider to be critical for the future of our own economies. In particular, looking at the clean energy transition, this is one area where it's quite clear that China has pumped massive amounts of subsidies and lots of money into the clean energy transition, which, objectively speaking, is a wonderful thing. But if you look at the difference in rules between how China can subsidize and support Chinese firms in the solar industry and the automotive industry as we move into electric vehicles and battery technologies, and also just the whole value chain of those industries. Europe has in some ways tied its own hands in terms of the limits it puts to state intervention into those sectors, whereas China has opened up the doors for subsidies which essentially distort the markets and make it so that Chinese firms can compete, are much more competitive in some ways with European firms because they have the backing of the state. They have lots of public funding that goes into them. And so ultimately what that means is that European firms, if you look at the solar industry, for instance, is a clear example of how China essentially now produces over 90% of the world's solar panels, and it's a similar situation along the entire supply chain for solar PV. That is a result of massive public funding, whereas Europe was also trying to develop that industry here, but didn't have the same policy tools, and so European firms ultimately lost out on competition grounds because it just wasn't the same. They didn't have the same advantages. And so when you start looking at how economic policies distort the market and how that plays out in the long term, that sort of hollows out the European industrial competitiveness in a way that ultimately leads us to be clearly dependent or over-dependent on China in critical fields as we move forward into the green energy transition, or if we look into the digital transition and things like this. And so that's one key sticking point that we've seen over time, and it hasn't improved despite our best efforts to try to convince China to play on a level playing field.
But don't you think that the US as well as Europe are also responsible for bringing the situation to this point where China has now penetrated into areas where probably the West has had a traditional advantage in science and technology, in energy sectors? But it was also the US and Europe who gave leverage or provided opportunities for China to first become a manufacturing hub of the world.
Absolutely.
So perhaps if we can, what you're really what you are saying, if we go back in time and look at the history of China in the last 40 years, we know that China was able to become a manufacturing hub because the US and Europe gave up their own advantage or their own space in manufacturing. In fact, a lot of jobs that went away in the US and Europe in manufacturing affected the lower classes, the middle classes in the West, and we know that a lot of complaints by the working classes were related exactly on this issue. So do you think that the US and Europe have been responsible for this?
Absolutely. We definitely have, the European and American governments definitely share a certain responsibility in how things have played out. But the underlying philosophy behind that, I would say, was, and I think it's been called into question now, and so we're seeing a sort of a complete shift in how we consider globalization in particular. And globalization was driven by maximizing efficiency and a much more of a liberal economic logic. And we say you let firms migrate around the world to find their where they're going to be, where they're going to find the lowest costs and where they're going to be the most competitive. And so if you allow companies to just set up based on purely economic conditions, ultimately what we see is that leads to distortions in the market when certain governments are willing to artificially inflate those conditions. And the logic behind China was that there is a need in terms of China's own economic development to put in place those policies, and there's a certain amount of acceptance, and you can say that's warranted up to a point. And once we reach a critical tipping point where those policies essentially continue on, whereas maybe China doesn't need them anymore, then China becomes artificially more competitive, and we find ourselves in a situation today where we depend completely on China for a number of critical industries, areas where we consider critical for our own economic well-being in the future. And we suddenly turn around and look at ourselves and say, well, I think maybe we went a bit too far with this logic of liberalism and globalization. And so now we're sort of starting to walk back some of those policies as we see that China isn't necessarily willing to make the reforms and changes that we would hope it would have made at some point.
Do you foresee the US and Europe becoming more protectionist, and perhaps your US and Europe will not repeat the same kind of model elsewhere with some other nation in the world?
I don't know if I would go as far as to say protectionist, but it is true that a number of policies do seem quite protectionist. If you look at the Investment Reduction Act in the United States, which is a wonderful thing at some levels for climate, the U.S. is pumping hundreds of billions of dollars into supporting necessary changes that need to be made to their economy in order to combat climate change. At the same time, there are a number of conditions in that legislation that clearly favor domestic production, which here in Europe we find quite unacceptable. Though we're also waking up to that very same reality that perhaps globalization went a bit too far, and that there is a need for industrial policy to come back and play a role. The question is would there have been a better solution? But it seems that given the realities of the global economy today, particularly the role of China, I would say, we're sort of re-leveling the playing field by moving more towards an approach of industrial policy, where if you like a bit of protectionism in terms of how we think about protecting or supporting industrial growth in our own economies and in protecting what we would see as the industries of our future and the bedrock of our economies moving forward. The need to be able to produce a certain amount of critical technologies and critical infrastructure locally and have a certain amount of local control over that, just for reasons of your own sovereignty. So I think we're sort of waking up to that new reality. We've been waking up to it for the last 5 years or so. That things need to change, but I don't think we've quite settled on just how far those things will change.
So how do you think Europe is going to maneuver itself through this new reality or new realization that has now occurred in the West?
Well, it seems that the Europe is largely taking a two-track approach. On one hand, it's acting in a more defensive manner, I guess you would say, looking at things like screening of foreign investments into areas where we feel that there has been a sort of leakage of critical technologies, critical know-how through foreign investment. Other instruments such as anti-subsidy measures to sort of try to recorrect some of those distortions in the market. There's an anti-coercion mechanism which is under consideration in the European Union to try to figure out how to act against other states who want to use their advantages and play on their dependencies and Europe's dependencies in order to try to influence our policies and our policy stances. So these are sort of more defensive measures to look at what Europe can do to sort of protect, in a way, what we have and to protect against undue foreign influence. At the same time, there are more offensive measures in terms of trying to build industrial policy and say, identify what the critical industries are for the future of Europe, whether or not it's in the digital space, in the energy transition space, and say, sort of what we call here in Europe the twin transitions, which will fundamentally structure the future economy of Europe, and to essentially say, look, we have to play industrial policy, we have to do industrial policy and allow the state to play a role, because otherwise we're just going to find ourselves completely behind in the game. And so that's this sort of two-track approach of playing defense and playing offense at the same time. That tends to be where we're going.
Since you work on energy and renewable energy and rare earth elements, let's go back a little back, in fact. The war in Ukraine. Many assume that this was going to bring the West together. There would be consolidation of the European countries, and all the entire NATO will be on one side, and then we'll see, obviously, we are seeing Russia and NATO confrontation going on in Ukraine. Has the war affected energy market, energy sector in the last 1 year or so? Because at the time of the war, in fact, in the last winter, we said there was going to be an energy crisis in Europe. We didn't really see much energy crisis. Many commentators, many experts have been pointing out the fact that the war has brought Russia and China closer. China today is buying massive amounts of oil and gas from Russia. Also coal. In fact, China has bought massive amounts of coal in the last 1 year. So how is the war playing on in the energy sector in Europe with sanctions on Russia over all the energy transactions, in fact, Nord Stream, the disruption of Nord Stream supply line? What is the status of energy market in Europe, as well as do you think that this war is going to help Russia and China come together on an economic level?
Very good question. I probably shouldn't say too much about energy markets in Europe because that's somebody else's field, and I don't master all of the elements to that. What I will say is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent what has come of that, particularly in the energy field, is really a wake-up call for Europe with regards to how we think about our strategic dependencies and how we build those for a long time. We were willing to accept a certain amount of dependence on Russia, not imagining that Russia would ever actually invade Ukraine or be as aggressive as it has been. And so this is sort of a return to reality in some ways, and a wake-up call for Europe. So to the question of how it's affected European energy markets, I mean, as you said, the energy crisis up until now hasn't been as bad as we would have thought it would be. I would imagine a lot of that is due to sort of the fluidity in global gas markets, the ability to find alternative supplies with LNG, which I would imagine, I don't have any statistics on it, this is just sort of my own economic logic talking, but I would imagine that has caused massive price spikes in global LNG spot markets, things like that. But it shows that there is a certain amount of flexibility within the global market. And that has allowed Europe to sort of weather the storm to a certain degree. But it's clear that Europe, the lesson that Europe is drawing and probably will continue to draw from this is that we need to think critically about our dependencies and how those can be used against us and how they are ultimately a source of vulnerability. And on the Russia-China piece, I mean, it's fairly clear that Russia's options are limited. China is looking at Russia very carefully, not wanting to cross certain lines in terms of the level of support that it provides to Russia, but at the same time not wanting to destabilize Russia. I mean, Russia's not, they share a massive land border with Russia. Russia is a major player in Central Asia, increasingly a player in East Asia as well. Russia has a massive capacity to disrupt. And the last thing that China wants is for Russia to use its disruptive power against China's own interests. So China has to play a very delicate balancing game with Russia. At the same time, I think in the West, the United States, or in Europe in particular, have maybe expected China to use its leverage on Russia to bring Russia to the negotiating table, get Russia to stop its war, this sort of thing. I think that China looks at a bit longer term in these issues, and essentially says, look, if we help you bring Russia into the fold, if that's even possible, if we get Russia to stop its war in Ukraine and to withdraw its troops and end the war in Ukraine, what does that actually get China in the long term? It does nothing to change the tensions between China and the West, and this will only allow the United States to turn its attention perhaps more squarely on China and to confront China in those terms. So I think China looks at Russia both as a potential source of instability, mm-hmm. but also as a necessary partner to have in its relations, its more conflictual relations with the United States in particular, but also its more complicated relations increasingly with Europe. And so it's pushed Russia and China together because Russia has no other options, really, but also because China doesn't want to see Russia completely fall apart and considers it could still be useful.
But how does this affect then Europe and China relationship? Why should Europe? I mean, there is a war going on in Ukraine. Ukraine has seen massive destruction of property and life as well. Where do you see this relationship going between China and Europe if China remains this either neutral party or takes a side?
Well, in many ways, China is not completely neutral. Their position is very very delicate, but it's not completely neutral. I mean, they've definitely supported Russia's line on the war in Ukraine. Don't call it a war.
So they think China is sort of more pro-Russia than...
Yeah, in the narrative, I mean, it supports Russia's narrative on what they do not call a war in Ukraine, and essentially putting the blame on NATO expansion, and using that as an excuse for Russia's aggression. That seen by many countries in Europe, most of Europe, all of Europe, is rather unacceptable.
But Europe hasn't really put any sanctions on China.
No, because China's actions in many ways haven't. I mean, you can't really sanction a narrative in that sense. I mean, So that's sort of diplomacy, and China has tried to play a role, or at least signaled that it's willing to play a role in some sort of mediating capacity. Whether or not that's realistic and China's role is in China is necessarily serious about doing that is another question. But clearly, China's position has complicated its relations with a number of countries in Europe, particularly those that share a border or are very close to Russia, that perceive Russia as their number one security threat, which is the reason for most of these countries joining NATO in the first place. Is because they're concerned about the Russian threat, and China as essentially the number one backer of Russia, even if they're not necessarily supplying lethal weapons to Russia, they're supporting Russia diplomatically, and definitely increasing their business ties with Russia.
You're not seeing European countries taking any, you can say, confrontational stand or confrontational stances with respect to China.
True.
We are seeing more of cooperation rather than confrontation.
Well, but the cooperation is certainly limited. The sort of delicate balancing act that China is playing is in many ways denying the reality of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and for much of Europe, that is seen as a reason not to pursue deeper relations with China in many ways. So it's not necessarily sanctioning China and saying, here we're going to place sanctions. So
you think that
because there hasn't been an action on China's part to necessarily warrant the cutting off of activities in certain sectors, but it's definitely thrown a lot of cold water on any momentum or any possibility that we could fundamentally deepen our engagement with China, because there is now growing skepticism about what China ultimately has in mind and whether or not China is a trustworthy partner in that sense. So it has put a brake on the advancement of relations with China for sure. So it hasn't led to clear pushback on China. Well, in some ways, I guess it has, and we can probably come up with a few examples, particularly in the case of Lithuania, for instance, which has much more conflictual relations with China these days. Relations with Sweden have been quite problematic, but these were all the case also before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But in many ways, China's stance towards Russia have made it so that these issues have not gotten better. They've only gotten worse, and that the political momentum or the political will to sort of deepen relations with China is difficult to find.
Soon after the pandemic and the lockdowns around the world, we heard that there will be supply chains getting out of China, and they will be moving to various other countries. We did see some supply chain shift from China and going to Vietnam, going to Philippines, and a few other countries in Southeast Asia. But on the whole, where do you see, despite the fact that many had claimed that, now this is the end of China's economic growth, and they have already reached the peak, and from here China is sliding down, or their growth will get arrested. Where do you see that whole prediction, or many people who had the expertise in the area? What do you think is the current status? With Europe being cautious, Europe and China relationship is not really the best in its time, but also not really deteriorating. Do you feel there's a stalemate kind of a situation between Europe and China?
Well, I think the trend for Europe is relatively clear in terms of we're now calling a de-risking strategy, where essentially we have identified a number of sectors in which we are over-dependent on China, and we need to de-risk those sectors, because it's clear that in many ways China could leverage those dependencies in its own favor. We've witnessed recently, just sort of a specific example, but since 2020, China has reduced and has now stopped exports of graphite to Sweden. For instance, graphite being a critical component of making batteries. hasn't done so officially and overtly, but in reality, exports of graphite are not arriving to Sweden to support Swedish battery makers. That's a form of leverage where essentially you say, look, China has the ability in many ways to stop Europe from developing critical sectors. So we have to look at those types of vulnerabilities and say, we need to reduce that type of vulnerability, diversify, either produce things in Europe or find other partners around the world. I think the key point behind all this de-risking strategy is really diversification, to avoid becoming over-reliant on any one partner, which also includes the United States in some cases, particularly in the digital field where we find ourselves very over-reliant on the US. But it's much more concerning with relation to China because there is a sort of a fundamental lack of trust, I guess you would say, in the relationship with China. We put things on a question of political values as well and political systems, and we don't know necessarily how these dependencies on China will be used against us. So we have to de-risk those, and that means
so there are possibilities that where Europe could be looking at alternatives away from China.
Absolutely.
But then China also has the stranglehold on rare earth elements, with in fact China having the maximum number, in fact the greatest amounts of rare earth elements in the world.
Sure. Well, it depends on what specific raw material you're talking about. And so China's dominance in rare earth elements, for instance, rare earths are sort of a specific group of raw materials, and maybe their most important usage today is in making permanent magnets that you need for electric vehicles, you need for offshore wind turbines, and also a whole bunch of other uses. But in that sense, China's dominance isn't necessarily in the mining sector. China has about 60% of global mining production for rare earths. A lot of that has actually moved elsewhere. 3 countries in particular, in Myanmar, in Australia, and in the United States, are major producers of rare earth elements. But China controls much of the downstream, the processing of these raw materials and the transformation into permanent magnets itself. And so it's not necessarily an advantage in terms of mineral deposits and that all of these minerals naturally find themselves in China. It's that China at some point was able to corner the market, become dominant in production, use that dominance to build downstream production and create bottlenecks in the downstream industries. And so what we see is China's dominance in the production of rare earth based magnets today, and that is in some ways more problematic than the raw material itself. But that's not something that you can't recreate a value chain overnight. It takes a long time. Some have said it takes 10 years to develop a complete value chain from mines to magnets in many ways, but it's something that we are looking at, that we have been looking at. And I think if you take the example of magnets in particular, when we look at our raw material dependencies on China, that has been sort of priority number 1 of how you can diversify that supply chain. Japan has been quite successful in doing that since 2010, when it had a number of run-ins with China on the rare earth field. The United States has also moved forward in that with the help of Australia, with the help of Japan, and Europe is also looking at using its various advantages along that supply chain. We have know-how, we have companies that are able to make permanent magnets. We have potential sources of rare earths. We know how to transform them. We just have to actually put all of those pieces together and make it work. So it's not a dependency on China that will always necessarily be there, but it will take time to undo that strategic dependency, which doesn't mean that we won't continue to do business with China in that sector. It just means we don't want to be 80%, 90%, 100% dependent on China, and so we need to find diversification and alternatives so that if China does decide to use that leverage from one day to the next, we can say, well, we can find alternatives, we can work around it. Yes, it will hurt, but it's not going to be critical.
So on this issue, clearly EU has made up its mind. And do you see any dissenters within the EU who may not agree with this idea and would in fact think that there is more benefit to have a status quo with China, because China already has the advantage, as you rightly pointed out, that it's not enough to just have rare earth elements. You have to create value chain. And they have built it over the years. They have the infrastructure, they have the skilled labor, they have the first movers advantage, you can say. So, do you think that Europe is unanimous on this view that we need to diversify and we need to create alternatives?
Well, I mean, you'd never be 100% unanimous. I'm sure there's dissension. First and foremost, this will cost a lot of money.
Yes.
Particularly in the context of high inflation. Where do you put your priorities? Where do you decide, this is worth spending a lot of money in paying the cost of diversification? But I do think that there is a broad consensus, at least. I don't know if there's unanimity because of this cost issue in particular, but I think there is a broad consensus that for certain questions in particular, I mean, the rare earth magnet question, I think, has been a priority for quite some time, that you do have to be able to afford that cost. If you look at other critical raw materials, so China recently, just a few weeks ago, announced that it would start controls on exports of gallium and germanium, for instance. In gallium in particular, China accounts for about 90 to 95% of global production of gallium, which is used primarily in creating semiconductors and what we call power semiconductors that go into 5G applications, that go into renewable energy applications, that go into electric vehicles. Anytime you need sort of a power source, you use a semiconductor that is more and more using gallium for the qualities that it affords you in terms of energy efficiency. And China has essentially said, we're going to start from the 1st of August to put export controls on gallium, and as well as germanium, another raw material, but gallium in particular. And we have to ask ourselves the question of whether or not that's a critical dependency. And that's where this issue of interdependence really becomes very important, in that China can stop its exports of gallium if it wants to, but China is also almost 100% dependent on power semiconductors produced here in Europe or in the United States for its downstream industries, for EVs in particular. And if you look at China's companies are on the verge of making a global breakout in the electric vehicle market, the last thing that they want is a supply chain issue that they caused by putting very stringent export controls on gallium that will lead to a stoppage in their access of certain critical semiconductors that they need to produce electric vehicles. And eventually Chinese companies will go out in the global market and say, well, we promised all of these cars, but we can't deliver because we can't get the semiconductors because we put a blockage on access to gallium. So it's a rather weak leverage in that sense, because the interdependencies within the market are such that China has no interest in actually using that lever. But we also identify that we do have a dependence on China in that sense. For power semiconductors, it will take China a number of years, up to about 10 years, to sort of be able to create its own players in the field of power semiconductors. So China has a sort of a long-term solution, in that the power semiconductors are not as complex as some of the more advanced technologies. So China will be able to eventually make up that difference and reduce its vulnerability there. So over that time, we also need to be concerned about how to reduce our vulnerability on the raw material that goes into those semiconductors. And so these are trends that will play out as China tries itself to reduce its own dependencies. China has a very similar strategy in terms of self-sufficiency and how it looks at its own vulnerabilities. And so in many ways, it's not that different from how Europe is also looking at its vulnerabilities. And so these will sort of work themselves out in the long term. But this is an example of where interdependence still plays an important role. And so we'll see how China actually puts into practice its exports on gallium. But my suspicion is that it will be relatively guarded in how it actually does that. It's more of a signal that it's sending to the United States to say that it's willing to start using that raw materials leverage or its supply chain leverages as relations with the United States get more complicated. But in practice, in this particular case of gallium, for instance, it makes no sense for them actually to do it.
Question: do you foresee Europe having greater, greener energy, renewable energy, than relying on traditional fossil fuel and oil and gas?
For sure, that is the goal. Carbon neutrality by 2050. We'll just see how attainable that is, but at least that's a clear policy goal that is put out there, a signal to industry, to consumers, to everybody, that this is a goal that we all need to collectively work towards, and I think in many ways, investments have been adapting to that, and projections for how we think about our energy future have been adapting to that goal. So fossil fuels will play a much smaller role in Europe's future and over the next 25 years, and so that's precisely why we need to think about what new industries and what new technologies are we going to be reliant on, and are we able to be competitive in those fields, and will we have areas in which we'll be dependent on others who will essentially say, look, you want to do carbon neutrality? Wonderful, but you depend on us, and if you want your carbon neutrality, then you have to make concessions somewhere else that's also important for you. And so Europe's ability to reduce those vulnerabilities and those points of leverage.
So you were basically saying that how countries in the West are increasingly willing to, in a way, renegotiate their relationship with China in certain sectors where they have the advantage and China has vulnerability, and they would also like to plug in their own vulnerabilities. Which are those areas where you think the West has a leverage?
Well, I mean, there are sort of two areas in particular. One is the global financial system, the dependence on the dollar, on the SWIFT banking system, where the United States and to some degree Europe, if we're talking about the SWIFT system, has major leverage. And then also in what we've seen, and there are probably others, but what we've seen is the United States has identified a very clear asymmetric advantage in semiconductors, where they're essentially willing and able to block China's access to the most advanced semiconductor technology, which is critical for developing future technologies in artificial intelligence. And so where the United States is being in many ways preemptive of a perceived threat from China, it's willing to use that leverage and to pull those levers of interdependence or dependence in this case. And so in many ways that these are two areas where the asymmetric advantage is such that those levers are very effective. But not all asymmetric advantages are equal. And so we talked about some of the raw material advantages that China has. Those aren't necessarily as advantageous as China might think they are, because in pulling that leverage, it exposes a vulnerability further downstream. And the production of critical raw materials, again, aren't necessarily something that China comes about naturally. It's not a natural monopoly that China has over gallium or had over and has along the supply chain of rare earths. These are things that can be built around. It takes time necessarily, but by pulling those levers of interdependence, you're signaling to other countries what their vulnerabilities are, and those countries will necessarily adapt. So in the case of finance or in the case of advanced semiconductors, China's ability to adapt is very limited. But on some of China's advantages, particularly in critical raw materials, it will take time, it will take money, but it is possible to plug those holes. And so unfortunately, we've sort of entered into this time where we're increasingly willing to weaponize these interdependencies. and everybody is searching for sources of vulnerability and how to plug those holes. And unfortunately, I think that leads to considerable amount of instability.
So you think that Europe will be struggling between the vulnerabilities of China and their own areas of leverage, and with the US also going to focus on these two areas where they think China is vulnerable?
Yeah, well, in many ways, in the case of semiconductors, for instance, Europe doesn't have a whole lot of choice but to follow the United States, because the positioning of the United States within the semiconductor supply chain and its ability to put in place extraterritorial policies that have impacts on others. If you want to continue to do business with the United States, if you want to continue to have access to semiconductor etching software, then you have to comply with the U.S. policy. Otherwise, you'll find yourself cut out of the American market. And so that's that is a sort of critical vulnerability for much of the world in a way, but not necessarily one that we have a solution to. So there are some areas of interdependence where you don't have a simple workaround, not even 5 or 10 years down the road, because the technology is such that it's almost impossible to recreate.
So how do you foresee Europe maintaining its strategic autonomy, or France, for example, you pointed out, uses strategic sovereignty? How do you think that they will be able to balance that?
Well, I think in a way the United States is seen as much less problematic because we have a fairly large degree of convergence on some of the more fundamental issues in terms of political values, in terms of support for a global rules-based international order. Even though some of those rules of the rules-based international order have been called into question recently, and perhaps even undermined recently, but we remain allies of the United States. We have a fairly large convergence of interests, and so while our vulnerabilities on the United States are concerning, and if we talk about what we call today is the anti-coercion instrument that the European Union is trying to develop, the origins of the anti-coercion instrument were concerns about the United States in many ways, in U.S. sanctions on Iran, and how those came back to hurt European companies. And so a lot of the talk and the discussion about anti-coercion was about vulnerabilities relative to the United States and how you try to work around those. I don't think we've really found a workable solution in a way, and so I think unfortunately this willingness to pull the levers of interdependencies is only making the world more unstable. But looking at the reality of it, if you fail to adapt to the fact that countries are now willing to pull those levers, if you don't take the defensive measures that are necessary to reduce your vulnerability, then you're going to find relatively quickly that you're in the wrong, in that your vulnerabilities will become your weakness.
Well, thank you for talking to us. It was really an enlightening conversation.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your good question.
Thank you.